Thank you very much, Melanie, for this introduction. I would like to introduce you to Eugene Ostashevsky and Andrey. Please come over and take the seats, and we're going to talk about their
Probably you should be in the middle, no?
Okay, no, I think this is better. Okay. Good evening, everyone. Melanie, thank you for an introduction. My name is Maria Genkin, as you've heard. I'm the volunteer, which is more important, and the board member of Razum for Ukraine. We actually do a lot of humanitarian effort right now. We've already sent over 14 million in humanitarian aid and in help to Ukraine. A lot more is in the pipeline. We were quite successful so far with our fundraisers, but we know that more is needed. So thank you very much for helping us in this task. Our mission in peaceful time is actually to unlock the potential of Ukraine and to amplify the voices from Ukraine in the United States. And as part of that effort, we actually always worked with a lot of Ukrainian writers. One of the writers that we're presenting today, Serhiy Zhadan, is a partner of our organization for many years. And the second writer, Volodymyr Rafeyenko, is actually the writer that we helped to bring about because we fundraised for his translation of this work. And the reason we knew this writers also is because we run a monthly Razum book club, and it's a passion of mine, and I see some of the Razum book club members here, which is very nice. We actually, 3 of the books presenting today, we read them in Ukrainian in that book club. So we know the literature intimately, and that's what we really like to do when the war is not happening in our country. Ukrainian literature is very diverse, very interesting. You may ask the question, why haven't we heard about it? Why aren't that many translations available? A lot of it is institutional issues. We're a young country that only got our act together after the Revolution of Dignity. There were institutions created that helped to promote and translate the writers. And this year was supposed to be a year when finally our literature would get noticed because so many interesting books would come out in English. And of course, as we were planning, to introduce you to this literature, also the invasion happened. But that actually only means that this work is so much more relevant because for the past 8 years, the only thing that Ukrainian writers could write about was war. And obviously that's not about to change. And the writers that are presented here, they're actually very relevant because all of what's happening in their books, it's happening right now. And the reason it feels so current because it's been happening since 2014. It hasn't just started on the 24th of February. The way this event will go, we actually have 2 translators here, Andrey and Eugene Ostashevsky. We also have recordings from 2 translations, so I'll do a short introduction about the author and about the book and kind of set it up, and then we'll hear a piece of it. And at the very end of it, we can ask the questions about Ukrainian literature, about the art of translation, anything that you're interested about. The first work that we're presenting today is by Serhiy Zhadan, and he's by far probably the most prominent, the most well-known Ukrainian author working today. He is actually a poet as well as a fiction writer. In poetry, he's been shortlisted twice for Pan America Poetry and Translation Prize. He's also received Derek Walcott Prize for Poetry. He was supposed to come to the United States in May. That's probably not going to happen at this point. He's also, he's gotten international prizes. He's been nominated for Nobel Prize, but by Polish Academy of Science this year. They've done it after the deadline. We're not very hopeful, but he's definitely the author that has enough creative output. He's also very young. He's 47-year-old. Right now, he lives in a city of Kharkiv, where he stayed, when the invasion happened. He's still there. He is delivering humanitarian aid. He is helping Ukrainian army. He is fundraising, for this effort. So, our kind of hearts and minds are certainly with him there now. But his novel, The Orphanage, is, it was written very shortly after the 2014 kind of war started. And it's set in East Ukraine, where he was from, where he was born. But you can't really, it's an unnamed city. It's a city that doesn't have a name. We kind of can guess what the city is, but the point is that it could be any city in any war. It's a very universal kind of experience of a civilian person being caught in a war itself. And today the setting for this novel could be Mariupol, could be Bucha, could be Kharkiv. Definitely when you will read it now, and I hope you will, you'll see the complete relevance to what's happening today. To set up the piece that you're gonna hear right now, in this novel we meet Pasha, who is a teacher, who is very apolitical, not really interested, thinks he can stay kind of outside of any crisis, not get involved in any fighting. And at some point, he has to go and get his nephew, who is stuck behind the front line that's kind of very quickly developed and approached, Pasha. So the whole book is a journey over a 3-day period to get his nephew and come back. And in this journey, it becomes like this odyssey when he's going through 10 circles of hell, meeting all these different people and experiencing the city that is has been rendered unrecognizable overnight. So in this particular scene, he actually finds his nephew, and all of a sudden the nephew is a bit smarter than he is because he's experienced a bit more, and he can teach his uncle a few things. So Isaac Wheeler, who is Isaac Stackhouse Wheeler, is the translator, together with Riley Costigan Hughes, and Isaac will read this excerpt.
Pasha is about to say something, but the kid is already up ahead, turning the corner. So Pasha decides not to continue this strange exchange. They go up to the first floor. The kid turns around. "Want to see a demolitions guy?" he asks. "What kind of guy?" "A dead one," the kid explains succinctly, and keeps going. They go up another flight of stairs. The kid opens a window between floors, steps onto the sill. Wet wind whips through the open window, along with the distant sound of explosions and automatic gunfire, particularly alarming in the rarefied morning air. Pasha hesitates, since he can't figure out where they're shooting, where the danger is, but then the kid extends a calming hand. "Come on," he says. "We can't go through the gym anyway. Nina's there. She won't let us." Pasha ventures out onto the windowsill, leaving behind heavy tracks, black as seals on documents. The kid goes right from the windowsill onto the canopy, and then onto some sandbags that are blocking the back entrance, and finally hops down into the thick morning fog. Pasha hops down after him. The kid's jacket flashes in the fog, a bright green splotch. Pasha heads toward it. They walk down an asphalt path, go behind a building, and enter an orchard. Leaves that never got raked up shine yellow in the fog. They bounce wetly when you step on them, so it feels like you'll get sucked into them on your next step, sink in up to your waist, fall into a pit or an open manhole. Then the path just disappears, but the kid knows where he's going. He confidently navigates the terrain, steers clear of the rebar sticking out of the grass, steps over a concrete stake lying between some apple trees, and dodges some wet, taut branches. Pasha is soon out of breath, but he tries not to show it. He doesn't want the kid to see that this morning run between the wet apple trees is wearing him out. "Almost there?" he asks the kid, trying to calm his breathing. The kid doesn't answer, though. Or maybe he does, but Pasha just can't hear him. They're suddenly stopped by a metal fence. Looks just like the ones at the zoo, he thinks. His school has a fence just like this one, too. The kid finds 2 bent rods, squeezes between them, slides over to the other half of the apple orchard. This all takes Pasha a little longer. He tries, gets caught, panics, backs up, sheds his jacket, and only then squeezes between the rods. The kid's gone. "Sasha!" Pasha yells into the thick fog. "Sasha, where are you?" He takes off his glasses, cleans them, puts them back on. That makes no real difference, though. Slips into his jacket, trying to warm himself up. The rain let up last night, and the fog settled, like snow that slid off a mountain and into a valley. He takes a step forward, stops, then another step. In the fog, he bumps into the kid, who's standing at the edge of a ravine, craning his skinny teenage neck, staring down warily. Down below, the fog is just as thick. At their feet, the ripped armholes of a valley open up before them. They can see yellowed grass and wet bushes. The fog snags on them, wraps around them like a spider web. Then the dense, milky expanse continues, dusky silver, endless. And somewhere over there, in that dense milk, a constant rumbling. and the gleam of yellow lights. Exhausting bursts of automatic gunfire crackle, mortar shells explode. Often, not like yesterday, but they can't see anything, so they get this feeling that they aren't exploding here, in this life, next to them. Smoke rises out of the valley. Smoke weaves into the fog like a dark strand into a dead man's gray hair, as fear and danger immediately return. "Watch out," Pasha says. "Step back." "You scared?" the kid asks without turning around. He's looking down, into the fog, mesmerized. "Where are those explosions?" Pasha decides not to continue this unpleasant line of conversation. "That one was on the edge of town," the kid says, listening hard. "And that last one was by the train station," he adds after a pause. "By the train station?" Pasha asks, surprised. "But it's just women over there. I was there yesterday," he explains. "You were on the prowl?" the kid inquires. "How would they know who's where? Maybe they think there's a unit posted over there, so they're hitting them hard." "Like they didn't know who was there," Pasha retorts. "Those guys," he hesitates, trying to figure out what to call them. "Those soldiers," he clarifies. "They stopped by yesterday. I talked to them." "That right?" the kid asks mockingly. "You talking to soldiers?" "All right, knock it off. What are we doing out here?" "Wait a sec," the kid replies. They're standing at the edge of the ravine, listening to what's happening down in the fog. Pasha realizes that the city's over there. Thousands of houses, thousands of trees, thousands of burrows and basements with thousands of residents hiding in them right now. Just try and find them down there in the fog. Try and track them down. Can't hear their breathing, their hearts beating. Can't hear anything. The thick fog filling up wrecked apartment blocks and mutilated manholes. That's all there is. And there's nothing you can do to help, Pasha thinks. Even if you wanted to get them out of there, try and pick them out of that stew. All he can do is stand here and listen to everything around him give way to destruction and death. "It's 7:50, the kid says suddenly. "Listen." Pasha takes out his phone. It really is 7:50. He listens hard, but can't hear anything besides the crackle of gunfire and rumble of mortars. Soon, a sound emerges out of the fog, barely audible at first, then more and more persistent. A dry, metallic buzzing, a stubborn, rhythmic drone. Endless, hopeless. "What's that?" Pasha asks, confused. "A phone," the kid explains. "Whose phone?" "The demolitions guy." "What's he doing here?" Pasha's trying to comprehend all this. Meanwhile, the droning sound doesn't go away. Someone's stubbornly trying to reach the demolitions guy. "So, there's mines everywhere." The kid points at the fog. "The security forces wanted to get all their vehicles out so they could leave the city. They sent some demolition guys in. One of them got blown up. About 5 days ago. Somewhere down there." The kid points ahead. "And someone calls him every morning. At 7:50. "Why 7:50? Are you dense or something? They call him right before school starts." "Who?" "Isn't it obvious?" the kid asks, surprised. "His son. Or daughter. Guess nobody told her that her dad's gone, so she keeps calling, like she promised she would." "Promised who?" "Her dad. Before he left." Pasha thinks of how he gets ready for school every morning, drags himself down the hallway, sits in the kitchen. It makes him feel so bad, like someone's calling him, and he can't even pick up. What's with his ringtone? Couldn't he pick something more interesting? "Whatever," the kid replies. "What, do you want him to use the national anthem? Well, maybe you should. You are a teacher, after all, a government employee." "What for?" "To instill patriotism," the kid says, laughing. "Do you even know the words?" "Listen." Pasha changes the subject again. "Gotta go get him." He nods in the direction of the fog. "Him just lying there like that." "Are you dense or something?" the kid asks again. "Want to get blown up too?" "Spring'll come. The snow will melt, and they'll take him away." "There isn't any snow down there," Pasha replies. "No, there isn't."
Our second writer is actually a very special writer. His name is Volodymyr Rafeyenko. And Volodymyr Rafeyenko, prior to 2014, lived in Donetsk. And he wrote only in Russian. So since 2014, he left, he fled his native Donetsk and he moved to Kyiv, and actually not to Kyiv, but to a small town next to Kyiv. And before I met him, I have never heard the name of that town, and now you all know the name of the town, because when the war came, Volodymyr Rafeyenko was living in Bucha. And he was supposed to be here with us. We tried to get him visa. We tried to get him come out. First, the U.S. Embassy closed the embassy. Then he was supposed to go to Poland, but you couldn't leave the country at that point because the war started. And he stayed in Bucha. And he was actually under occupation until March 20th. So, Marko, who is his translator, was able to organize the evacuation mission that was actually at great personal risk to Rafeyenko and to people who organized it. But at this point, we got him to a safe place, and I'm sure he's already writing something about that experience. But this particular book is very special because it's his first book that he wrote in Ukrainian, and it's a book about the internally displaced person like himself who had to leave his home, move to Kyiv, and then decided that I'm going to learn Ukrainian language because this is, what this is about. And when he starts learning Ukrainian language, it actually opens up like a portal into a memory he didn't know he has. It becomes very spooky, very mystical. There's a lot of allusions and fairy tales. It's a very kind of modernistic and very very interesting prose. It's certainly not what we just heard, because it's a much more modern prose, let's say. And Marko is going to give a little bit more of a set of what the scene he's going to read about. Marko is a professor of Ukrainian literature at Columbia University, really the only one in a quite a big tri-state area, I think, who is teaching Ukrainian literature, which is something we definitely need to change. He's also an amazing musician, and he's a translator of this work and many other work of Ukrainian fiction. So, yours.
Thank you, Maria, so much. Thank you all for coming. Yes, we really wish these authors were with us, and Volodya, we talked about this, setting this up, and Volodymyr was supposed to be presenting tomorrow in front of my students at Columbia University because they're reading this book for my course. So, but we will do it eventually. We know that, and it'll be another opportunity to get together. So, I want to thank Razum for helping support the translation of this novel, transforming this into this, the Ukrainian Book Institute, and my own Harriman Institute at Columbia University, which also supported with the publication grant. Yes, so the scene I'm going to read for you today is the main character, Gabriel or Haba, who's this loner in Kyiv, but he's able to get a job at this supermarket called The Beautiful and the Beneficial, and his boss there is trying to set him up with his niece, who's from Chernivtsi, who's from Western Ukraine, to help him with his studies and to have a bit of a social life. And in this scene, Haba, there's a dialogue. Haba will be speaking, as will his niece, Ole Lukole, her name is. But there's also a very important character in the novel, and this is a mare's head. Yes, you heard right. The head of a mayor that follows him around as he's trying to learn the Ukrainian language, and as it's creating all these transformations in him. So the mayor's head also appears in this. In addition to,
if I may add, it's the head of a dead mayor.
Yes. It's from a Ukrainian folk story, and also in the book. And the book is full of intertextual references to a lot of Ukrainian literature, to Russian literature, Russian Soviet pop culture. That's in here as well. And then it actually ends with another quote of a beautiful poem by Vasil Stus, a writer who was arrested in the Soviet Union and died in prison. So, but this is Haba at a cafe in Kyiv with Ole Lukole. They leisurely drank the cognac, laughed, and conversed nonchalantly and freely. The big difference in our ages, he thought, and in our political and philosophical preferences does not bother us at all. Her little eyes shine. The Ukrainian language just pours out of her petite round mouth. Her little teeth loom white. Her every move, every smile seems so refined, so measured. You think, young Kozak, that I'm dying in vain, but I am, young man, controlling your brain. It's been so long, Haba deliberately exulted, so long since I've had a conversation that was so beautiful and beneficial. Habinsky was happy for quite a while, maybe for 2 hours, and maybe for a whole 3. It was now clear that this was not a chance meeting, and this long evening with its Baltic clouds, rain, which had no interest in stopping, and with its cold and penetrating evening wind, was also not just fortuitous. No, this girl is not just some random creature on my life path, Haba thought enthusiastically. And everything that we ate and drank was not consumed by us accidentally, but in the proportions that were necessary in order to move slowly, but at the same time headlong, or as they say, a bit bent over, in a steady, warm, and promising direction. For the first time in a while, Habinsky felt like he truly desired something in a concrete sense. And what person in his shoes wouldn't? And just in that moment, when Habinsky had definitively figured everything out for himself, the stool next to him became occupied by the mayor's head. By the way, it said, taking off its wet hat, it's already cold outside. I'm tired of waiting for you, boy. But whatever, as you wish. Habinsky was pretending that he hadn't heard anything. I see that you're not the politest of dudes, the mayor's head, or the MR, as it's in the novel, noticed. But what can you do? It swiftly grabbed the sausage sandwich from his plate and began to chew, gnawed, munched, and periodically, in a very ladylike fashion, coquettously nibbled. You and I have a Ukrainian language lesson scheduled. And in your life, language is paramount. Whether you want to or not, I'm going to make sure you learn it. In a few years, you'll have developed such an impressive lexicon that the late Lukash would be jealous. You'll see. Haba twitched his wide cheekbones, pressed his lips, and tightly closed his eyes. If he had just been a little bit less fond of Ole, he would have gotten up, bid farewell, and left. But there was hope that the MR would back off if he would just ignore it. Okay, let's begin, the insatiable main scoundrel dreamily droned and grabbed a poppy cookie. So, we have established that a verb is an independent element of language that describes an action or state and that answers questions. What questions? Well, all of them, I guess. I'm begging you, get out of here, Habinsky requested, attempting to speak as calmly as possible. We'll get together at home and discuss everything. Verbs, adjectives, pronouns, susura and semenko, drach and franco. Get away from me, please, oh my blessed joy. Excuse me? Lukole raised her eyebrows. Forgive me, Habinsky jerked his shoulders. I was not referring to you. To whom then? Compared to Proto-Slavic and Old Ukrainian, the MR continued, the contemporary Ukrainian language has a simple verbal system. Listen, grab me a cherry pyatsuk. This cognac really makes me crave something sweet. Forgive me, I should have warned you, but I was hoping that we could avoid this douchebag. Haba pulled out her handkerchief and wiped his sweaty face. The fact is, it is next to us. It is, as they say, among us. What is, Gabriel Bogdanovich? Ole became anxious and carefully looked around. Just hear me out, and then you can leave for good, okay? Habinsky asked. Just hear me out. That's all I ask for. And an accordion in the trenches sings to me. That's fine, no problem. No need to panic, Ole glanced around again. Is it an old acquaintance of yours? You could say so, Habinsky nodded. Why don't we just get out of here? I think it's too early to go home, but there's a bunch of nearby places where you could sit down, continue our conversation. What do you think? The mayor's head hadn't stopped speaking for a second during all of this, and continued the lesson in a soft and pleasant baritone. It would only stop occasionally now to take a sip of cognac out of Haba's glass. And the ending she was formed out of the older si through he. And this, my boy, is all the first palatization. And so, to put it briefly, the pluperfect and perfect remained. Let us continue. Participles decline the same way that adjectives of the hard group do. The thing is, Haba tried to focus with all of his might, that it's impossible to get away from this beast. Is it some kind of woman? In a certain sense, yes, he agreed, given the MR's thick mane, the stink eye. Well then, I guess I pretty much get it, the girl sighed, almost out of relief. Conditionalis, the Latin modus conditionalis, from condition, which means condition, a grammatical sense which speculates that we wish would happen or could happen under certain conditions. I would prefer never to see you again in any condition. Habinsky slammed the table. I implore you, go away. Give me a break. The glass flipped over onto the saucer. The tea spilled along the table and began pouring onto the floor. Their table caught the attention of everyone present. Habinsky sensed that he had finally lost his composure. Fine, the mayor's head agreed after taking a dramatic pause. Go. We'll look at this as an opportunity for you to practice your language. But I'll go with the two of you because somebody has to watch over you. Yes, we do need to go, Haba stood up. If that's okay with you, of course. We can talk somewhere else. Well, we can speak some other time if you're that busy, Ole said, with an unpleasant astonishment and glanced at her watch. Please, he almost methodically took her little warm hand, looking into her eyes with wonder. Let's continue talking about Galicia, about Chernivtsi, about folk dolls, or about other lofty, heavenly, and uplifting things. You spoke about them so enchantingly. It even made me want to live there, perhaps for a bit, perhaps with someone. You know, occasionally I would get a desire to come to Western Ukraine on a whim and live there amongst the locals for some time. Like a dead man among the living. He became silent for a minute. But then occasionally the other way around. Sometimes it's the other way around. Haba settled the check and they got dressed and went out to Yaroslavl Val. Haba and Ole popped up their umbrellas and unhurriedly headed for the metro. Your acquaintance stayed behind in Yaroslavl, right? That's why you're so sad? The thing is, Habinsky said, a star shone upon me this morning, thrusted through my window, and grace lay on my gloomy soul so brightly that I blissfully understood. The star is just a splinter of pain, stretched out eternally, as if by fire. Thank you.
So what's really interesting about this novel is this is like the Russian language writer, right, writing his first novel in Ukrainian, and we all agree you can't translate that into Russian because so much about this novel is actually about him learning Ukrainian and kind of playing with it, and it's a very, but I think in English it kind of works on a very different level. So those of you reading in Russian, don't count on reading it in Russian, definitely read it in English.
Or Ukrainian.
Or, well, if you can't read it in Ukrainian, yes. Our next author is Andrey Kurkov, and I'm not sure, can I actually have like a show of hands if you've heard about Andrey Kurkov? So I think this is, you know, he has the distinction of actually being the most popular or the most published Russophone writer, and not just a writer from Ukraine, but really of any writers writing in Russian. He's published a lot in Europe and really, really famous in Europe. His first novel, Death and the Penguin, actually he self-published in Kyiv, and then it was translated into German, and then it became an international sensation with about 30 languages, I think it was translated in. Still, you know, could be more known here. He was born in Leningrad, writes in Russian so far, but he always speaks in Ukrainian, and he actually firmly identifies as a Ukrainian writer. He's the president of PEN Ukraine. He was living in Kyiv on February 24th, kind of not believing that anything would happen, so he had to get evacuated with his wife. And the book that we're presenting today is his latest translation into English. He's actually translated quite well, but his latest book, Grey Bees, is the book on this person's, Serhiy, living in the gray zone in Donbass between the Ukrainian army and, you know, whatever the hush-posh of Russian and the local fighters on the other side. And the Serhiy is a beekeeper. So he gets very kind of tired of living in this gray zone with the fighting, with both sides kind of always, you know, approaching him. And he decides to give his bees a little bit of a break and take them on vacation to Crimea. Crimea is by that point already occupied by Russia, but he remembers that he has this Crimean Tatar who is his friend. So he wants to take the bees for a vacation and also visit his friend. Little does he know, when he gets to Crimea, he realizes that his friend has actually disappeared because the Russian security forces have questioned him and taken him away. And he finds this kind of Crimean Tatar community in disarray and not knowing what to do about it, or in general how to live. And we wanted to read this piece specifically because the kind of Crimean situation is almost forgotten given everything that's happening in Ukraine. But Kurkov, very wisely introduces it in his narrative. And also Crimean Tatars is this minority in Ukraine, which is, the Muslim minority, but also kind of feeling very strongly right now as Ukrainian identity. So we thought, this is a very appropriate kind of thing to read at our gathering to remind you that Ukraine is not ethno-homogeneous. There is actually a lot of different groups there. So if you don't mind, and it's going to be read by Boris Draluk, who many of you may know as a really good translator from Russian and a poet, and also the editor of LA Review of Books.
When the sun lay down on the mountain, Serhiy walked out to the road as usual. The last wearily yellow rays of light still fell on Albat. Like a magnifying glass, they seemed to bring the village closer, to enlarge the roofs of its houses, some of gray slate, some green, some red, as well as its squat mosque and church. The day dimmed its light slowly. The setting sun gradually draped the valley with the mountain's shadow, the shadow of the passing summer day. The village receded, while Serhiy stood on the hill over the vineyards lost in thoughts. He emerged from them when, down in the half-darkness of the valley, street lamps began to come on, one by one, and in their wake, here and there, lights appeared in the windows. Thank God, Serhiy said to himself. And he had the strange sense that it was he who had somehow restored the village's power. He felt it had not been for nothing that he had stood there for half an hour or more until the sun went down and the air lost its transparency. He had stood there, he felt, in order to control the delivery of nighttime light to Albat. Illuminated by this nighttime light, the village looked more romantic and attractive than it had in sunlight. The glow of the street lamps emphasized the lines of the roads, as well as the considerable size of Albat, which contained at least 24 streets and lanes. Now Serhiy felt, in the light of the street lamps, he could actually see the village that bore the unusual enchanting name of Albat, which was not indicated on any road signs. It seemed to him that Albat now lived, breathed, and spoke its Albatian language behind the luminous windows of its houses. During the day, on the other hand, or in the evening, before the darkness settled and the lights came on, what he saw down there was Kuibyshevo. That place spoke Russian, that is, Kuibyshevan, and differed little from Little Starhorodivka, if one ignored the southern vegetation. This thought captivated the beekeeper and led his mind onward. It occurred to him that when this village was deprived of power, it remained Kuibyshevo at night. On such nights, the non-coziness he knew so well could only be driven away by lighting candles. Then Serhiy's thoughts jumped of their own volition to his home in the gray zone, and a brief sadness arose in his eyes. He remembered the pot-belly stove in the middle of the room, remembered the warmth it gave him all winter long and into the spring. But he knew that the pot-belly stove and the house were far away, being looked after by Pashka, and the lights of Albat managed to dry the sadness in his eyes, returning him to a calm, joyful mood. Such a mood puts life in balance and creates the illusion that calmness is in itself happiness. After taking his fill of illuminated evening Albat, Serhiy turned round and began to carry his calmness and tranquility back to the tent and the apiary. But then a distant siren drew his attention. And it wasn't just one siren, but a few of them, if it wasn't a trick of the mountain echo. He turned again, and far away on the road that led to Albat along the Belbek, he saw flashing red lights. Several cars were speeding towards the village. Now he definitely heard multiple sirens, and their noise, though distant, grew louder and louder. The cars flooded the road with the bright glow of their headlights. The convoy turned left, drove through the streets, and, after 2 more turns, came to a stop. The sirens fell silent. The red lights ceased their flashing. Albat grew quiet again, but Serhiy found this new silence unnerving. Looking intently at the cars, which still had their headlights on, and so were clearly visible, the beekeeper concluded that they had stopped somewhere near Isilu's house. His anxiety intensified. The convoy's incursion into the peaceful silence of Albat alarmed him. His mobile phone showed that it was 10:30, not especially early, not especially late, but exactly the hour when all sorts of misfortunes tend to occur. They occur, these misfortunes, due to human vulnerability in the face of the darkened world, the world.
Our last book today is the only book by a woman. It's the book that's a collection of short stories, and the short stories are about women. So I think it's a very good kind of closing point to our discussion. Yevgenia Belorusets is actually many things. She is the writer, the journalist, the artist, and she's very famous as a photographer, as a matter of fact, probably more famous as a photographer right now than a writer, although she's certainly writing more and more now, and that's changing a bit. As a photographer, she's been documenting humanitarian crisis in East Ukraine since 2014. She lives between Kyiv and Berlin, but February 24th found her in Kyiv, and she started writing a diary for the German newspaper that Eugene has been translated to English and published. Not you.
I mean, I translated just one.
Just some of it.
No, it was a group of people.
Okay, so but it has been translated to English, and I'm sure it's going to actually find its own publisher because it's quite kind of immediate and very powerful writing about what's happening in Kyiv in this war. She also writes in Russian, and actually what's interesting about this collection is that she kind of almost deliberately stayed away from identifying which language each of the women speak and who they identify with, and are they on this side of the conflict or that side of the war. Like, she really made it about the women and their lives rather than their identity. But what's kind of I found very curious, and I don't know if Eugene would agree, is that during this last, in the invasion part, when she was staying in Kyiv, she started writing in social media in Ukrainian, which I haven't seen her do it before. And I think that's sort of what happened to Rafeyenko and other Donbas writers, is that they've transitioned kind of their language from Russian to Ukrainian, with the war. And I'm just, I'm mentioning it because I find it as a very interesting illustration that Vladimir Putin's actions are actually contrary to his intention. So the more he tries to preserve the Russophone culture of Ukraine with force, the less of it remains, really, because there is that idea that we don't want to be protected, and the way Olena Styashkina, who is another great Ukrainian writer, she says that for her the Ukrainian is a language of safety, and Rafeyenko says that it's the language of the Ukrainian language is the question of national security. So I think we're just going to see more and more of it now after this latest round of war they're putting us through. So Eugene Ostashevsky is a fantastic poet, and he teaches at NYU, and I've known him for many years, and very excited to hear him read from his translation of Lucky Breaks.
Okay, I'm going to read a short story called Chronicle of a Revolt from a conversation with Katerina N. In 2015, in the course of judicial proceedings against hairstylists, manicurists, and other workers at the Pyramid Beauty Salon, the examining magistrates, if they may be styled as such, voiced a question that for the government of the city-state of Anthracite ought to have cleared up, if only a little, the causes of the revolt. The examining magistrates inquired after the fashion by which mutinous ideas and thoughts grew and took root in the heads of the beauty salon workers. This question was interestingly answered by Ksenia Semyonovna, one of the leaders of the revolt, senior specialist in men's hair arrangement, also known citywide as master of the page boy and the A-line bob styles. We recently saw, each of us saw, no one missed any of it, how many townships have been disturbed, homes turned upside down, women left to litter the road, frightening passers-by with their uncleaned bodies, how many conquests and reconquests had been carried out in the name of freedom and independence. We've seen it all: the miners' revolution, the Orange Revolution, the Revolution of Dignity, and our own Anthracite revolution. We've witnessed the making of deeds and the acquiring of titles. Somebody transferred the title of the stables in the village of Dyakova. Somebody appropriated the deed of the municipal market and 2 gas stations. But we're broad-minded people. We've never been petty. They want the gas station, they can have the gas station. They come to get their hair done but show us no respect, it's on their own conscience. That was how our minds took everything in, and we too learned to arrange revolutions. Ksenia Semyonovna's address alluded to the political and military events that deeply disturbed the daytime and nighttime routines of Anthracite, in consequence of which the city briefly seceded from the Luhansk region, as well as from the newly formed state of the Luhansk People's Republic, to become a state unto itself, ruled by a Cossack host with Ottomans at the head. In all probability, reasoned the examining magistrates, after a series of events which will probably not be mentioned here at all, Ksenia Semyonovna herself and her entire beauty salon fell party to the changes that were taking place right in front of their eyes. At some point, it even became evident that the Pyramid Beauty Salon was not the sole organization to grow aware of the necessity of change. An entire series of other hairdressing establishments, a fitness center, and 2 supermarkets in the neighborhood also opted for mutiny. We have yet to investigate all this in the most meticulous fashion, to draw up a court record, and to do everything conceivable, everything that lies within our human reach, to ensure that such events do not repeat. It is not the right time to be lenient with the likes of Ksenia Semyonovna. All the same, it doesn't seem possible to describe Ksenia Semyonovna as a mutineer or revolutionary in the classical understanding of these words. After all, ordinary mutineers, for example, the Ukras, the Bandera bandits, or simply the dissatisfied, create an environment of their own. They tear themselves away from the rest of city people, turn inward, immerse themselves fully in what they do, take to procuring unauthorized flags from who knows where and addressing each other in prohibited languages. They often walk out on their families, stop seeing loved ones, rupture relations with their habitual milieu. Yet, Ksenia Semyonovna and the workers of her salon never disengaged from their environment. They went about their business, cut hair, manicured nails. They knew many people in town and socialized with anyone fate carried into their salon. Their readiness for mutiny did not contradict their usual way of life. Each of them maintained that she wished to make Anthracite better. Whose patronage and influence the city found itself under was supposedly a question that lost all meaning for them. They insisted they had risen above politics. Nevertheless, for all the rebels shared, if rather vaguely defined ideas, they still had not developed a single ideology whose emergence, as any schoolchild knows, is a requirement for revolutionary organizations. Neither the enhanced interrogations nor the scrupulous study of the social networks of the detainees have disproved that hypothesis. The arrested women entertained a rather broad range of opinions. They had received entirely different educations and owned up to an astonishing variety of preferences and perceptions of life in the world. The beauty salon workers included a former student from the Department of Philosophy at the University of Luhansk, an accountant, an actress, a professional pastry chef, only one professional manicurist, but several certified master hairstylists who, moreover, belong to different and even mutually hostile schools and traditions of the art. Some of the salon workers composed fluent letters, open or personal, in which they swore never to repeat such a truly fatal mistake, and requested in emotional tones to be let out of the cellar and return to their families, to their husbands and children. But others, especially the two sisters, Angelica and Albina, wrote with the crudest solecisms, unable to adequately express a single thought. Constantly straying into old petty squabbles, they argued that they had been systematically underpaid for haircuts for several months already, and that if it were not for constant humiliation, they never would have helped Ksenia Semyonovna, even though she stood godmother to their children. It is thereby evident that the rebel ranks harbored representatives of well-known and respectable families in Anthracite, as well as entirely unknown women from the provinces who had moved to Anthracite from adjoining villages in search of a better life. Nevertheless, they all clearly desired to undertake some activity in the name of either the future of Anthracite or its present. This readiness of theirs invited suspicion, making them stand out among the other inhabitants of the city. And yet, in the course of this investigation, the distance that is usually in evidence between apprehended or captured enemies and their examiners did not arise between the rebels and the Cossack specialists from the Anthracite secret services. There was no class barrier. For example, a fascinating contradiction was observed in the case of the said Ksenia Semyonovna. Her husband, Stoyan Sergeyevich, codename The Appropriator, was an independent soldier, militiaman, amateur martial artist, and activist for the sovereignty of Anthracite and its secession as a city-state. He conducted agitation among the students of the Professional High School of Automotive Transport, exhorting them to join the managed spring movement and the battles for the city's independence. He furthermore served as the personal consultant of the highly respected Ataman Kazitsyn, a man capable of wide-ranging, historically informed ratiocination. Finally, due to his gifts in the field of diplomacy, he often traveled to Donetsk and Luhansk in order to establish intergovernmental communication relations for Anthracite. Stoyan Sergeyevich, the very same individual, abetted the people's cause with all his considerable talents, yet did not notice the alien elements under his own nose in his own family, a fact he subsequently deeply bemoaned. Stoyan Sergeyevich's statement of contrition became a key event in the court proceedings against the mutineers. Indeed, for its breadth, as well as for the profundity of the issues touched upon, his repentance eclipsed the verdict and sentence, the justice and humanity of which astonished even the issuing magistrates, who did not expect of themselves a corresponding delicacy toward the enemy, manifested moreover at a moment of historical significance for the city-state as it pursued a war of liberation against two townships, several neighboring city-states, and states, properly speaking.
Thank you, Zhenya. I never quite heard people of Anthracite speak, with such a Brooklyn accent. It's just, really, it will never change, for me. I know we're probably running late in time. I don't know if we have some time for questions. I can open it up with just, kind of asking you to talk about what was challenging in these translations and what you found kind of the most interesting. And then if any of you have any questions, maybe we'll spend another 10, 15 minutes on that.
Well, challenging, there were many, many references, and I'm very lucky because my wife is always somebody I can always consult, especially with things. I'm born and raised in Philadelphia, so a lot of the references that are made to Russian culture or to Soviet culture, I don't know, but I was able to consult with my wife on that, so that was very helpful. But there was one interesting aspect of this as well, and Volodymyr and I talked about this. The fact, like Maria said, that he's writing this novel in a new language for himself, right? But those of us who know two languages, you have one language that's the best, your native, your first language, and then another language that at least in my case and other people I've talked to, there's a certain distance from that language that you feel, that you sense that somebody whose first language that is doesn't have. And that obviously can lead to problems and not knowing and using the language properly, but it can also be a really interesting way of looking at that language from a distance and seeing things that somebody who knows it from really up close doesn't. This is very helpful for language games. Oftentimes, I'll make puns in Ukrainian language that, again, I'll mention my wife Yevgenia, she would understand, like, why are you rhyming these two words? But for me, I'm seeing them a little bit differently. Volodya is writing this book in Ukrainian. Now, he has a certain distance from this language. My first language, or not my first, but my best language at this point in my life is English, but my Ukrainian is pretty darn good, but I have that little distance from Ukrainian. So it was interesting for me to translate, trying to see where that distance exists in Volodya's Ukrainian novel. And it's also interesting, as the novel develops, he seems to, his prowess in the Ukrainian language seems to get better as the novel gets, and I'm pretty sure he did that on purpose. There's a lot of mixing in the beginning of the novel, so that was very interesting, kind of seeing it from that way, and trying to see how the joy that he expresses in learning and like all the things that are new to him in Ukrainian language, like the vocative case, which Russian doesn't have, right? He uses that and he plays with it, or all these diminutives that Ukrainian is just loaded with, and you just see the joy of this writer using these, which I think was special, and I tried to pass that along.
I can also add that after I read, the novel twice, I think, in Ukrainian, and then I read the translation, and there are notes in the back of translation. So I started reading the notes. I'm like, that's what he meant. I mean, it's really, to me, like Mark's actual annotated edition was really great, to read even after, I read it in Ukrainian, because a lot of allusions were really not clear. Eugenia, do you want to?
Well, here, I mean, in this story, there's actually, there's also a huge amount of distance from the language, which is done in a very different, ironic way, right? There's a lot of language comedy in the story, which takes the point of view of the examining magistrates, but makes it funny because of these long, incredible sentences. Like the last sentence was really hard to read because it went on for half a page. And then all of these words that don't quite fit together, there are all these weird incongruities. And and that's very, very challenging to translate. Luckily, I also have a distance from English. So. But yeah, I mean, the challenge here also is that a long sentence in English and a long sentence in Russian, these are two very different phenomena, right? In a way, because Russian has looser word order, but also because modern English, modern American English, has all of these restrictions about, like parallel grammatical forms, about the way to do lists, which she doesn't observe, obviously. But so I needed to do a little violence, do a little deformation to the English to kind of alienate it, but not so much that it becomes ugly, right? So and observing or illegible, and observing that precise distance. That's not easy.
I'm also wondering, actually, in that case, because you do know some of Russian literature, and this is a Russophone Ukrainian literature, did you sense that the language was quite different? Because that's like a big topic of conversations. Is Ukrainian Russian, somewhat different from Russian? Like, did you notice any of the kind of peculiarities that you observed from?
I mean, in aesthetically, yes. Rhythmically, yes. Okay. In terms of linguistics, no. Right. The vocabulary is the same. But for Belorusets and for, I think, a number of other Russophone Ukrainian authors, it's very, very important. I mean, she's very conscious about writing Russian that's not Russian. And she's not alone. We had conversations about this in Berlin. And a lot of the violations of not linguistic norms, but kind of grammatical norms here are due precisely to that, kind of to that desire to develop. But it's also, and I mean, in a certain sense, this makes her Russian more Ukrainian. She trained as a translator, a literary translator from German. So this is somebody who actually knows how the German sentence works, and you can definitely feel that here.
Thank you. Do you have any questions that anybody from the audience want to ask?
And if you do, you can just go right up to the microphone in the aisle.
I can ask one more while you guys, kind of like, maybe it's beating the dead horse, haha, but.
It's there.
There's one head left. But wanted to kind of like figure out, and I'm thinking about Misha Idov, who is the American screenwriter, and also he's from Latvia, but he's a Russophone, writer in some sense. And he just recently posted something about, Sorokin, and he said, well, if you really want to understand the Russian imperialism, you don't read Sorokin, you actually need to read Ukrainian literature. So I'm kind of wondering if you could speak a little bit about the need. I mean, obviously there is a war going on, and we all kind of see the horrors, but what is the need beyond that? Like, why do we need to have Ukrainian literature in the conversation?
Well, it's a new voice. It's a new perspective. It's a new perspective on a lot of things that maybe people are used to having Russia comment on from that perspective. So these are things that should interest somebody who's interested in what's been happening in that part of the world and then what's happening in that part of the world. So it's a voice that really hasn't been heard much at all, and it's on, and it always has been kind of on the front lines of very important issues, as just like identity and and how gender and how history and how memory is involved. So Ukraine, like every culture, offers its own particular, not that it's any better than any, but it's a perspective that has really been not known. And I think if people that are interested in these kind of universal themes can really see another aspect of them, the new nuances of it. And in Ukraine's case, it's very intense. It's very close because of just what's been happening historically and politically. So, and I think it's very exciting. And another thing that Ukrainian language, and here I'm speaking about not just Ukrainian language written by Ukrainians, but Ukrainian language written in the Ukrainian language. And we've talked about this before. There's a certain energy that you can feel in writers writing in a language that has been told it doesn't exist, that has been, persecuted for years, has been trying to be wiped out, and probably would have been wiped out if things hadn't turned the way they did in the last 30 or so years. So writing in a language that's kind of on the edge of non-existence, I think, offers it a certain sense that may be unique to other languages that are in that position, that are not kind of in a more stable.
I have, if that's okay, I have a more academic answer to this, less about contemporary literature. If you look at the way Slavic literatures in general, or Soviet literatures in general, have been presented in the States, it's basically been Russian literature, and pretty much Russian literature, like, period. Okay? There's been very little of the other stuff. And it's a tremendous distortion of what was happening. And one of the things I would like to see is not, that I think is necessary as a corrective, is not just, the publication of authors living today, which I think is great. I completely welcome it. But I would like to see translations of older material, of modernist material. And actually before, like, I would love to see, like, good edition of Skovoroda in English that you can use in the classroom, and not necessarily in the Slavic classroom, the kind of stuff. This is an 18th century philosopher from Ukraine, and poet. I sometimes teach kind of global philosophy classes for freshmen, sophomores, blah, blah, blah. This is something I would love to use in the classroom if there were good editions of it. And then even, Russian literature right now, by which I mean literature in Russian, is, for me, kind of excessively attached to Russia. When I was in graduate school in my 20s, I was friends with an older Russian poet, Russian language poet, Alexei Parshikov, who was actually from Kiev, who talked to me about Ukrainian poetry, with whom I read Ukrainian poetry from the 17th century, with whom I talked about Skovoroda. And so there are all sorts of things that we think of as Russian literature and kind of instinctively identify with Russia, which don't belong to Russia, or shouldn't belong to Russia.
Or like Gogol also.
Right. Yeah. Well, Gogol is. Yeah.
But you can, like.
Yeah. There's a lot. There's a lot. This is not really wartime is not a great time to talk about this. But, my hope that, at some point that Ukraine also claims literature in Russian that has to do with Ukrainian themes, that is in Ukraine, and this way to take away some of the Russian literature from the Russian Federation.
Really decolonizing, getting.
No, but
But
it's the same thing that happens in North Africa with French and stuff.
Yeah, for sure.
We do have one question from a Zoom viewer by Dominique Hoffman. I'm intrigued by the fact that so many Ukrainian writers also work as translators. I wonder if our panelists have noticed ways in which this work of bringing literature of the world into Ukrainian impacts the work of writing in Ukrainian.
It's interesting. Yeah, a lot of Ukrainian writers translate because that's how they make a living. In addition to writing columns for newspapers, and their fiction or poetry or nonfiction. But it's interesting because, like Maria mentioned, since Ukraine and Russia war started in the Donbass 8 years ago, and I think you used the words Ukraine finally got its act together or something like that. I'm paraphrasing, and you got the Ukrainian Book Institute. Institute, and you had a government of Ukraine that was actually supporting Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian writers, you had an exponential amount of translations into Ukrainian that were never seriously funded and happening. So my point is, in the last 8 years, a lot of more writers have been translating into Ukrainian because there have been publishing houses that have been publishing this. You go to Ukraine, you walk around, all of a sudden you have translations of American literature, of Polish, of German, and you never had that. It was all just in Russian. And nobody, people did question it, but nobody really did anything about it. But so this is a wonderful thing because, of course, when a writer's translating, they're enhancing their language, and this is a normal process for any culture. But this was something that was denied for the longest time. So it's very important for a financial aspect, but also for the enrichment of Ukrainian language. And I think it will certainly be reflected in their writing in some manner.
I actually have examples of some books that I was only able to read in Ukrainian because they're just not available in English. So I was like, I can now read it. It's this translation from German of this really interesting novel that I was recommended, and we read it in Ukrainian in our book club because it's not available in English. So in some ways, there was more available in Ukrainian through Germans are really good about giving grants, and Ukrainians were using those grants translating. So whether it changes their language, do you feel like it changes? Maybe more in poetry than in prose.
No, I think it must. I mean, when you're translating, you're working within language. You're probing this language of yours to try to express something that I think it cannot not affect you. Yeah.
But I think there was also a lot of translations into Ukrainian in the 1920s. No.
Again,
there were classical. There were
I think Zhadan was actually, spearleading this effort. Who is our, great modernist poet that was actually translated recently. There was a new edition of him coming out to English. That he kind of also gave a lot of work to a lot of Ukrainian poets in the 30s and the 50s, actually. Like they were translated like the classics. It's a lot of classical work you could find in Ukrainian, and but the Soviet Union was not promoting people reading in Ukrainian, so culturally it was very difficult to find those books. Kind of nobody was reading it. Whereas now, even like the Russian literature in translation to Ukrainian, people read that, even though everybody in Ukraine could read it in Russian. But there is actually an interest in kind of process it in their own language. Certainly seen that.
Yeah, but Zhadan's right. But it was also in part because there was support for publication in Ukrainian language, and that's
But I think Eugene is also right about the modernism, because we had this, and this is just kind of like telling you in general how the story of Ukrainian literature happened, is that we've had an amazing explosion of modernistic prose and poetry. So writers like Khviliovy, Semenko, you name it, Підмогильний, and you haven't read any of that. Like everybody knows Babil, everybody knows the corresponding writers in Russian literature. The reason you haven't read them is because they were mostly killed in 1937. They were arrested. Khviliovy killed himself in 1933 because he saw the famine. So we actually have the term that's called executed Renaissance, right? Because like all these writers that just started to do this amazing work because there was a period when the Soviet Union was kind of helping that, and then it was all kind of killed. So none of that has been translated to English. So we're certainly hoping, and there are some works, there are some translations already ready to go. Razum is looking into fundraise for some of that. Montegreen has actually been published by Harvard University Press, and there is a great effort there to build like a library of Ukrainian prose by people at Harvard. So I think next year, hopefully, we can repeat this event with 4 more books or 5 more books that we can present next year. Because war or no war, we need to get this happen. We need to get this literature here because that's part of our identity. And this is what Vladimir Putin says, it doesn't exist, so we have to prove to him that it does exist by bringing it out in the world. I want to thank also Center for Fiction, and Melanie's coming up to say something, but thank you so much.
Thank you. you. Thank you so much. This is so wonderful. Thank all three of you, our two translators who maybe are watching on Zoom. And thank all of you for coming tonight. The books are available in the bookstore. We've also got more than these four translated, so please check it out and come see us again. Thank you.